Hey guys, tonight we step into the chilly candlelit mornings of Tudor England, where dawn creeps slowly over timber-framed houses, and the first meals of the day are far from the avocado toast and lattes you might expect. Imagine heavy wooden tables laden with rustic bowls, thick porridge steam swirling into the cold air, and the clatter of metal spoons against earthenware. You probably won't survive this morning without a good stretch and maybe a strong cup of something, because Tudor breakfasts were as practical as they were peculiar. This was a world before quick cereals and breakfast bars, where morning meals were an essential fuel for hard days, but not always a feast of flavors. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Then drop your location and local time in the comments. I'm curious where you're starting your day or winding down. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through bustling streets as smoke from hearths mingles with the cool morning air, nobles preparing for court and laborers waking to a day of toil. The breakfast table varies dramatically depending on who you are, lord or servant, merchant or farmer. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In Tudor England, breakfast was not a universally cherished meal. Often it was simple or even skipped by some, especially the upper classes who favored later, more substantial meals. You notice the smells of rye bread baking, thick stews simmering, and the occasional sweet pastry foods that grounded the day and carried people through long hours. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some Tudor breakfasts included meat and fish, not just the sweet or grain-based dishes modern readers might imagine, reflecting a hearty, sometimes unexpected start to the day. Historians still argue whether breakfast was a formal meal or a casual snack for many, with regional and social differences clouding the picture. Some evidence suggests it was more common among laborers and children than nobility. You settle at the table as the day begins, realizing breakfast in Tudor times was a patchwork of tradition, necessity, and evolving tastes far more complex than you might think. Next, you'll explore how social class shaped these morning meals, revealing a world divided by food and fortune. You step into a grand Tudor manor's kitchen, where the aroma of baking bread mingles with the sharp tang of cured meats. Here, breakfast is a reflection of status, a meal that speaks volumes about who you are and your place in society. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In Tudor England, social class heavily influenced breakfast habits. Nobles often had lighter breakfasts or even skipped the meal, while common folk and laborers relied on a substantial morning meal to fuel their demanding days. You imagine a wealthy lord sipping watered wine or ale with a small portion of bread and cheese, while a farmer's family sits down to a hearty bowl of pottage, thick, savory stews filled with grains, vegetables, and sometimes meat. Here's your quirky tidbit. It wasn't uncommon for children and apprentices to have breakfast as their main meal, often consisting of leftovers from the previous day's dinner or simple porridges to keep hunger at bay during long work hours. Historians still argue whether the upper classes considered breakfast a necessary meal or merely a casual snack, with some suggesting the concept of breakfast as a social ritual developed later in English history. You feel the contrast between the grand halls, where breakfast was often a hurried affair, and the humble cottages, where it was a vital source of strength. This divide highlights the broader social inequalities of Tudor society. You overhear servants bustling about, preparing different meals for different tables, a silent dance of status enacted through food and timing. Here's where you realize that breakfast was not just nourishment, but a marker of identity, dividing families, communities, and the very fabric of Tudor life. Next, you'll uncover what actually appeared on these Tudor breakfast tables, moving beyond assumptions to the forgotten flavors and foods of the era. You pull back the heavy curtain to reveal the typical Tudor breakfast table, less the Instagram-worthy spread, and more, a practical array of rustic foods designed to sustain long days. The table creaks under wooden bowls filled with porridge, coarse breads, and sometimes salt-cured fish or cold meats. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Breakfast in Tudor England often consisted of simple, hearty fare like oat or barley porridge, coarse bread and ale or small beer, a drink with low alcohol content, safer than water in those times. You catch a whiff of ale mingling with smoky hearth aromas, mingling with the scent of freshly baked rye or barley bread staples of Tudor kitchens from humble cottages to manor houses. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some Tudor breakfasts included cold meat slices leftovers from previous dinners served alongside fruits like apples or pears, showing a surprising diversity beyond just grains and ale. Historians still argue whether sweet breakfast foods were common or rare, with evidence suggesting that sugar and spices were luxury items mostly reserved for the wealthy or special occasions. You imagine the clatter of wooden spoons digging into thick pottage, the steady murmur of morning chores, and the quiet hunger that pushed families toward these modest but filling meals. Here's where you feel the contrast between the enduring staples and the fleeting luxuries of breakfast shaped by availability season and social standing. You notice that despite its simplicity, Tudor breakfast was more than mere sustenance. It was a reflection of a society balancing survival with emerging tastes and customs. Next, you'll dive into the grains and porridges that powered these mornings, uncovering forgotten recipes and textures lost to time. You sit down to a steaming bowl of porridge grains, swollen and creamy after hours of slow cooking. In Tudor England, grains like oats, barley, and rye were the morning's true staples, nourishing bodies hardened by work and weather. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Porridge was a common Tudor breakfast, made by boiling grains into a thick, warm dish, often seasoned with salt herbs or sometimes sweetened with honey when available. You imagine the rough texture of coarse oatmeal mingling with the earthy aroma of barley, filling the air in kitchens and cottages alike. It was simple, sustaining, and could be varied according to the season or one's means. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some Tudor cooks added ale to their porridge for flavor and extra calories, creating a hearty, slightly fermented breakfast that might raise eyebrows today, but was prized then. Historians still argue how widely sweetened porridges were consumed, with some suggesting that the use of sugar and spices was limited to the wealthy elite, while common folk mostly ate plain, salty versions. You sense the importance of grains not just for breakfast, but as a dietary cornerstone reflecting the agricultural realities of Tudor England, where wheat was expensive and oats and barley more accessible. You hear the low murmur of morning conversation around the table, punctuated by spoonfuls of porridge and the occasional crunch of crusty bread. It's a ritual both mundane and vital. Here's where you realize porridge was more than food. It was a social equalizer linking noble and peasant through shared reliance on the earth's grains, even if prepared and served differently. Next, you'll uncover the surprising role of meat and fish at Tudor breakfast meals that might challenge your modern breakfast expectations. You raise your spoon to discover a surprise hidden in Tudor mornings. Meat and fish were more common breakfast companions than you might expect. This wasn't just bacon and eggs. It was often cold cuts and salted fish leftovers from the previous day's feast. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In Tudor England, it was customary, especially among the upper classes and wealthier merchants, to include slices of cold meat, such as salted beef, pork, or even fish at breakfast, reflecting a different meal structure than today's standards. You can almost taste the salty tang of cured herring or mackerel served alongside coarse bread and porridge, a combination designed to satisfy long days of work or governance. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some Tudor households served chuck steak for breakfast, a thick cut of meat often cold and eaten without reheating, showcasing a no-fuss approach to morning protein. Historians still argue about how widespread these practices were. While the nobility enjoyed lavish spreads, many common folk likely had simpler fare-making meat at breakfast, a luxury rather than a staple for the masses. You imagine the practical reasons behind this leftover roasts didn't go to waste, and the protein provided essential energy before the day's labors. Breakfast was less about fresh preparation and more about efficient sustenance. Here's where you appreciate the Tudor approach to food economy, a resourcefulness that shaped meal choices and reflected the era's frugality and priorities. You overhear servants arranging platters of cold meats ready for the household's awakening, each slice a thread connecting the day's past and future. Next, you'll explore Tudor breads and early pastries, revealing the sweeter side of these forgotten breakfasts. You now gaze upon the humble yet essential Tudor breads and pastry staples of morning tables that might look rustic to modern eyes, but were the foundation of any breakfast spread. Imagine dense rye loaves, coarse barley breads, and the occasional sweet treat made with early recipes. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Bread was a vital part of Tudor diets, with a variety of grains used, and was often eaten with butter cheese or drippings. White bread was reserved for the wealthy, while coarser breads filled the tables of common folk. You smell the earthy aroma of freshly baked loaves cooling by the hearth, their thick crusts cracking with a satisfying crunch, promising sustenance and warmth. Here's your quirky tidbit. Pastries were just beginning to appear in Tudor England, often simple meat pies or sweet tarts filled with dried fruits and honey, far from today's flaky croissants, but prized nonetheless. Historians still argue how frequently pastries featured in breakfast, with some suggesting they were mostly reserved for special occasions or the nobility, while everyday breakfasts remained modest and hearty. You feel the tactile pleasure of tearing a crusty slice, dipping it in thick ale or warm porridge, savoring textures that defined Tudor mornings. Here's where you appreciate how these breads and early pastries connect to the land and season the rhythms of harvest and baking central to daily life. You notice bakers in bustling markets, their hands shaping dough that would nourish families across social divides. Next, you'll sip into Tudor beverages, ales, wines, and waters that accompanied these morning meals with flavors far removed from today's coffee or tea. You lift a sturdy mug filled with a dark, frothy liquid, this morning's beverage far from the coffee or tea you might expect. In Tudor England, drinks were as varied as the people, with ales, wines, and even spiced waters taking center stage at breakfast tables. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Ale was the most common drink in Tudor England, consumed daily by people of all classes. It was a nutritious, fermented beverage, often safer than water due to the brewing process killing harmful bacteria. You catch the earthy aroma of malt and hops, the ale's bitterness balanced by subtle sweetness, a robust companion to heavy breads and porridge. For the wealthy, wine was also common, served diluted to temper its strength. Here's your quirky tidbit. Tudor households sometimes flavored their water with herbs, spices, or even rose petals, creating refreshing waters that added a touch of luxury and variety to the morning meal. Historians still argue how much tea or coffee, now staples of breakfast, were absent or rare before their introduction to England in the 17th century, highlighting a dramatic shift in morning customs over time. You imagine the clinking of mugs and quiet conversations as families and workers alike gathered around to share warmth and sustenance. Here's where you see the importance of these beverages, not just for flavor, but as vital sources of hydration and nutrition in an era before clean drinking water was widely available. You watch as the tavern fills with morning patrons, the air thick with the smell of malt and smoke, a testament to communal life centered on food and drink. Next, you'll uncover the social rituals and etiquette surrounding Tudor breakfasts, mealtime manners that reveal much about the era's values. You lift a sturdy mug filled with a dark, frothy liquid, this morning's beverage far from the coffee or tea you might expect. In Tudor England, drinks were as varied as the people, with ales, wines, and even spiced waters taking center stage at breakfast tables. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Ale was the most common drink in Tudor England, consumed daily by people of all classes. It was a nutritious fermented beverage, often safer than water, due to the brewing process killing harmful bacteria. You catch the earthy aroma of malt and hops, the ale's bitterness balanced by subtle sweetness, a robust companion to heavy breads and porridge. For the wealthy, wine was also common, served diluted to temper its strength. Here's your quirky tidbit. Tudor households sometimes flavored their water with herbs, spices, or even rose petals, creating refreshing waters that added a touch of luxury and variety to the morning meal. Historians still argue how much tea or coffee, now staples of breakfast, were absent or rare before their introduction to England in the 17th century, highlighting a dramatic shift in morning customs over time. You imagine the clinking of mugs and quiet conversations as families and workers alike gathered around to share warmth and sustenance. Here's where you see the importance of these beverages, not just for flavor, but as vital sources of hydration and nutrition in an era before clean drinking water was widely available. You watch as the tavern fills with morning patrons, the air thick with the smell of malt and smoke, a testament to communal life centered on food and drink. Next, you'll uncover the social rituals and etiquette surrounding Tudor breakfasts, mealtime manners that reveal much about the era's values. You find yourself at a bustling Tudor breakfast table where not just food, but manners govern the morning ritual. Breakfast was as much about social order and etiquette as it was about nourishment. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Tudor dining etiquette dictated seating arrangements, use of utensils, and even topics of conversation, reflecting one's social status and education during meals, including breakfast. You notice the careful placement of knives and spoons, the passing of bread and ale with a nod, and the strict rules governing who eats first, who speaks, and how one behaves before the meal concludes. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some households employed spoon holders, servants who ensured that communal spoons didn't touch the table or other dishes, a surprisingly early nod to hygiene and decorum. Historians still argue whether these etiquettes were strictly enforced across all classes or more relaxed among common folk, with evidence suggesting both rigidity in noble households and more informal customs elsewhere. You sense how breakfast served as a microcosm of Tudor society, where hierarchy and respect were woven into every gesture, bite, and word. You overhear whispered instructions to a young servant on proper table conduct, revealing the educational role of meals in shaping behavior. Here's where you understand that breakfast was not just the first meal of the day, but a stage where social roles were enacted and reinforced. Next, you'll peek into the breakfasts of Tudor children and apprentices, revealing a different but equally telling morning experience. You step into a smaller chamber where Tudor children and apprentices gather around rough-hewn tables, their breakfasts, a far cry from the lavish spreads of the nobility. Here, morning meals are simple, hearty, and designed to fuel long days of learning or labor. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Children and apprentices in Tudor England often ate modest breakfasts, usually porridge bread, and occasionally small portions of meat or cheese to sustain them through demanding work and training. You hear the clatter of wooden bowls and the low murmur of conversation as young hands clutch spoons, eagerly consuming whatever was provided before a day of chores, schooling, or apprenticeships. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some apprentices were given extra breakfast portions on market days or during festivals, a small reward and an important boost for their grueling routines. Historians still argue about the nutritional adequacy of these breakfasts, with some suggesting that many children faced food scarcity or monotony, while others highlight the role of family and community in providing for young workers. You feel the blend of care and hardship, the need to nurture growth despite limited resources, and the strict schedules that shaped early Tudor life. You imagine apprentices learning trades by day, fueled by these early morning meals that might seem humble, but were vital in shaping England's future artisans and craftsmen. Here's where you see how breakfast was a foundational experience, not just physically, but socially and economically in Tudor households. Next, you'll journey to Tudor inns and taverns, discovering the breakfasts served to travelers and townsfolk outside the home. You step into a lively Tudor inn, and the air thick with the mingled scents of roasting meat, spiced ale, and fresh bread. Here, breakfast is a communal affair, blending the needs of weary travelers, merchants, and townsfolk beginning their day. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Tudor inns and taverns commonly served breakfast to guests and locals alike, offering simple yet hearty fare, like bread, cheese, pottage, and ale, to sustain those on the road or in the market. You imagine the clatter of mugs and plates as patrons share news, barter goods, or simply enjoy the warmth after cold nights, the inn's hearth crackling against the morning chill. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some inns specialized in brewers' breakfasts, where ale was consumed not just for pleasure, but as a staple of nutrition, sometimes stronger and more filling than the food itself. Historians still argue how consistent and varied breakfast offerings were across different regions and establishments, with some inns catering to wealthy travelers and others serving rustic fare for common folk. You sense the importance of these social spaces, not just for nourishment, but for connection, commerce, and information exchange, as breakfast fueled not only bodies, but communities. You overhear a traveling merchant recounting tales from distant markets, his breakfast, fueling stories and deals alike. Here's where you realize that Tudor inns were vital hubs of morning life, blending diverse people through the shared experience of food and drink. Next, you'll explore the medicinal foods and remedies often consumed at breakfast, revealing Tudor England's belief in food as medicine. You find yourself in a Tudor household kitchen where food is not only fuel, but medicine, a belief woven deeply into the morning meal. Breakfast was often laced with ingredients thought to heal, strengthen, or ward off ailments. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Tudor England's diet was closely linked to contemporary medical beliefs, with foods like vinegar, honey, and herbs consumed at breakfast for their supposed health benefits. You smell pungent herbs hanging from rafters, jars of honey and mustard lining shelves, all part of a tradition that saw food and medicine as inseparable. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some Tudor recipes for breakfast included spiced ale mixed with herbs to soothe digestion, or warm the body, a drink that doubled as remedy and refreshment. Historians still argue how effective these medicinal breakfasts were, or if they primarily served psychological comfort, reflecting the era's humoral theory, where balancing bodily humors was key to health. You watch as a cook prepares a morning broth infused with rosemary and sage handed to a family member nursing a cold or fatigue. Here's where you grasp how breakfast was a carefully crafted blend of nourishment and healing, an early form of functional food culture. You overhear a mother advising her children to eat slowly and mindfully, believing the right breakfast could set the tone for health and vitality. Next, you'll examine how seasonal and regional variations influenced Tudor breakfast menus, shaped by what the land and climate offered. You walk through the patchwork landscape of Tudor England, where breakfast plates reflected the changing seasons and the region's bounty. From coastal fish to inland grains, the morning meal was a mirror of geography and time. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Seasonal availability shaped Tudor breakfasts significantly, with summer mornings offering fresh fruits and herbs, while winters relied on preserved meats, root vegetables, and hardy grains. You imagine coastal cottages where fish and seaweed flavored breakfast stews, contrasting with northern farms where oats and barley formed the basis of porridge and bread. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some regions, locals favored specific breakfast dishes like the hasty pudding in eastern England, a simple boiled grain dish, quick to prepare and filling. Historians still argue how much trade and market access diversified breakfast choices across social classes and regions, with some suggesting wealthy households enjoyed imported spices and sugars absent in rural kitchens. You sense how environment and economy intertwined, making breakfast a dynamic reflection of place and status, season and supply. Here's where you realize that the humble Tudor breakfast was never static. It evolved with nature's rhythms and society's shifts. You hear farmers discussing the day's work while breaking their morning bread, rooted in centuries of tradition, yet adapting with every harvest. Next, you'll debunk some myths about Tudor breakfasts that linger in popular imagination today. You settle in to hear the stories and myths that have grown around Tudor breakfasts, images shaped by modern imaginations more than historical reality. It's time to sift fact from fancy in this forgotten meal. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Contrary to popular belief, Tudor breakfasts were not lavish feasts, but often practical, modest meals, particularly for common folk. The extravagant dishes depicted in movies are more fantasy than fact. You chuckle imagining the idea of Tudor nobles enjoying pancakes with maple syrup, a modern invention far removed from the 16th century kitchen. Here's your quirky tidbit. One persistent myth claims the Tudor breakfast included jacks or small cakes tossed for luck, a practice more rooted in later traditions than Tudor reality. Historians still argue how much theatricality influenced our view of Tudor daily life, with some scholars emphasizing the gap between courtly banquets and everyday meals. You see how popular culture romanticizes Tudor breakfasts, sometimes overshadowing the grit and practicality that defined actual Tudor mornings. Here's where you understand that history is often rewritten by storytellers, and recovering forgotten breakfasts means peeling back layers of myth to reveal lived experience. You imagine a Tudor kitchen not as a stage for grand feasts, but as a place of hard work, nourishment, and subtle traditions passed quietly through generations. Next, you'll dive into the debates historians have about what Tudor breakfasts truly looked like based on patchy records and archaeology. You find yourself amid the dusty pages of historical records, piecing together the tantalizing fragments of Tudor breakfasts that scholars argue over menus, account books, and archaeological finds offering glimpses but no full picture. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Tudor breakfast customs are sparsely documented, leading historians to reconstruct habits from estate records, household accounts, and sometimes cookbooks written decades later. You imagine researchers debating the interpretation of vague entries. Was bread and ale a full breakfast or a quick snack? Did spices signify wealth or occasional indulgence? Here's your quirky tidbit. Some archaeologists study dental remains to infer diets, revealing that even noble Tudor diets were sometimes gritty and coarse, reflecting bread made with unrefined grains. Historians still argue about regional variations, class distinctions, and the impact of emerging trade on Tudor breakfast foods, with new evidence sometimes challenging old assumptions. You sense the thrill and frustration of historical detective work, balancing clues, context, and educated guesses to breathe life into forgotten meals. Here's where you grasp that Tudor breakfasts were as diverse and complex as the society itself, shaped by economics, culture, and geography. You envision a historian tracing the crumbs of history back to a bustling Tudor kitchen, uncovering the tastes and textures of a morning long past. Next, you'll conclude with the legacy of Tudor breakfasts, how these humble meals influenced future English culinary traditions. The morning sun rises gently over England, casting light on centuries of breakfast traditions that began in Tudor times and evolved into the rituals we know today. The humble and hearty meals of the past laid the groundwork for future culinary developments. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Tudor breakfasts, with their porridges, breads, and ales, influenced the development of English breakfast culture, paving the way for the more elaborate meals of the Victorian era and beyond. You imagine families gathering around tables not so different from those centuries ago, sharing warmth, sustenance, and stories that connect generations. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some modern British breakfast staples like oatcakes and certain types of pastries trace their roots back to Tudor recipes preserved and adapted through time. Historians still argue about the continuity of breakfast traditions, debating how much the Tudor meal shaped later English cuisine versus imported influences over the centuries. You feel a comforting connection between past and present, where every bite of breakfast carries echoes of history's kitchens and tables. You close your eyes, picturing a Tudor household waking to the aromas of fresh bread and porridge, the quiet murmur of morning prayers and conversations, a world both distant and familiar. And as you drift into sleep, remember that even forgotten breakfasts hold stories worth savoring, nourishing not just the body, but our understanding of the past. Sweet dreams.